On April 16, 1945, Soviet forces began their final assault on Berlin. The artillery fire was constant, even shaking the interior of the Führer bunker, where Hitler and his inner circle awaited a miracle that would never come. The Red Army had completely sealed off the capital, turning it into a prison without bars. They were lurking in every corner, and the last Nazis were cornered. Their fate seemed to be written in stone. The escape from the Chancellery bunker was risky, but it also meant the only alternative to avoid a terrible death in the clutches of the Soviet Union. In this new military history video, we will learn everything about the feat planned by the last German leaders. In addition, we will discover the enigma of the whereabouts of Martin Bormann, Hitler's feared secretary who mysteriously disappeared and was sought for decades. Join us to relive one of the most sinister pages of World War II. The final days of the Third Reich were a grim and tense period. The mighty Germany, which had brought several European nations to its knees for years, was now reduced to a country whose only aspiration was to resist. The defense of its capital was all it had left. Pride drove many soldiers still standing, but others continued to fight simply to carry out Adolf Hitler's orders until the end. Meanwhile, the Führer saw his world shrink to four walls of an underground lair. He was inside the bunker of the Reich Chancellery, in the heart of Berlin. He knew that this would probably be his last refuge, as he refused to flee the city and had no intention of being captured alive by his enemies. However, he was not going through this stage of despair and resignation alone. He was accompanied by many of the members of his inner circle, such as his partner Eva Braun, or the loyal Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, and his family. Within those walls, secretaries, officers of various ranks, and assistants were also present. They were all waiting expectantly for the events outside. A few days after the start of the Soviet assault, the loud sounds of explosions gave the signal that the first line of defense had fallen. There was no turning back. The adversary was advancing through the streets of Berlin. By the end of April 1945, the city was surrounded by the Red Army under the command of Marshal Zhukov. Their actions were devastating, fighting in every corner of the capital against exhausted and poorly equipped German troops that could not contain the offensive. Stalin's men were approaching, stealthy and thirsty for blood. They were looking for a primary objective: Adolf Hitler. His head would be the trophy of victory.
April 26, Berlin. Hitler wakes up to massive Russian artillery and aerial bombardments. It is the final blow. The Soviet 8th Guard, under Marshal Zhukov's command, is the first to break into the city. Fighting block by block, they begin their manhunt.
At the height of tension, the Nazi leader began to show a clear deterioration in his physical and mental state. He often complained of ailments, and his ability to make rational decisions was totally compromised by his growing paranoia and refusal to accept the military reality of his forces. Nevertheless, he continued to issue orders, often impossible to carry out. Partly due to the brutal Soviet advance, but also due to Hitler's constant ravings that assigned counterattacks to troops that had already been annihilated. Finally, he accepted with his closest confidants that the time had come to accept defeat. The Führer knew what this meant. If he fell into the hands of the Red Army, the worst torture imaginable would await him. For that reason, the decision to take his own life was already a fact. However, before that, the Nazi leader wanted to complete a series of steps. One of them was his marriage to Eva Braun, which took place on April 29, 1945, in the middle of his confinement. Another, perhaps more relevant to history, was the drafting of a will in which he left in writing who would be his successor. On the evening of the same day that he finalized his marriage, he determined that HlTLER would become president of Germany after his death. Although this admiral of the Third Reich Navy had earned the respect of the Führer in the last stretch of the war, his appointment was a surprise. For years it was clear that the heir to the Nazi throne would be Hermann Göring, commander of the Air Force, and one of the most important men within the regime. However, in the midst of this chaotic end, things changed minute by minute. Göring would soon be considered a traitor and expelled from Hitler's inner circle. By the end of April 1945, the commander of the Air Force was in Bavaria and sent a telegram to the Chancellery in Berlin to find out if the Führer was still fit to govern, or if it was his time to take office. The message also made it clear that if he did not receive a reply within the next few hours, he would assume that the Nazi leader was incapacitated and would proclaim himself leader. This situation infuriated Hitler, who was forced to change the future of the German government, which was reeling in the face of an advancing Red Army. Time was running out, but the Führer was not prepared to surrender without a fight.
This last-minute resistance enrages Soviet soldiers into even greater acts of brutality. Guns are fired at point-blank range into buildings. 2 days later, Soviet troops ready themselves for a final assault on Hitler's Reich Chancellery.
Unlike other members close to the Nazi leader, HlTLER was not in the Führer bunker, but he was soon contacted. His assumption of office was imminent. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide along with Eva Braun in their private rooms in the bunker. The dictator shot himself in the head while his brand new wife ingested a cyanide capsule. The bodies were found by his aides, who took them to the garden of the Chancellery, following the orders left by the leader himself. They were doused with gasoline and burned to prevent them from being captured by the Soviets. Among those flames, the evil that had stalked Germany for more than 12 years was extinguished. However, the story continued. At this point, we must ask ourselves, what happened to the Nazi leaders who were in the bunker after the death of the Führer? One of the most famous cases is that of the Goebbels family. Both Josef, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, and his wife Magda were devoted followers of the Nazi leader. After he took his own life, they declared that it was not worth continuing in this world and followed his example. However, before shooting themselves in the head, the couple poisoned their 6 children with cyanide. This macabre ending tells us about the fate of 8 occupants of the shelter. But they were not the only ones who were there when the Soviet troops advanced ferociously.
Also, there were a number of senior generals, including Generals Krebs and Burgdorf, Gestapo Chief Heinrich Müller, Brigade Führer Monke, and Werner Naumann, the newly promoted Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Amongst the less senior personnel, but still within Hitler's closest entourage, were Otto Gunscher, his SS adjutant, Heinz Linger, his valet, long-standing driver Erich Kempka, his pilot Hans Bauer, and Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, his personal physician, all of whom were now faced with the same choice of surrender or attempting an escape.
The first to react was General Hans Krebs, who tried to negotiate surrender with the Red Army forces. However, Stalin was not looking for peace, but revenge after years of bloody confrontations. The response was a resounding no, and the soldier chose to take his own life, just like Hitler and the Goebbels. The last Nazis in the bunker debated whether to follow the same path or flee, fearing that an escape would mean betraying their country and the regime they had defended. Out of fear of committing an ethical error, they decided to follow the example of the most important leader who still remained in the place, Martin Bormann.
Bormann was a long-standing member of the Nazi Party, having joined back in 1922, and with a mixture of ruthlessness and manipulation had worked his way up the party ranks until in 1943 he became Adolf Hitler's private secretary. It was in this role that he continued to gain power and considerable animosity by controlling access to the Führer.
This important figure of the Third Reich had remained at Hitler's side until the very end. During the last weeks of the Führer's life, he was one of the key players in trying to maintain some order amid the total collapse of the regime. Despite the chaos, the constant military meetings and the devastating news from the front, Bormann remained active, transmitting the leader's orders to the army commanders and trying to coordinate what was left of the Nazi state apparatus. At the end of April 1945, as the Soviet encirclement was closing in, Bormann was one of the first to realize that the situation was desperate. Still, he maintained a pragmatic attitude and was one of the members present during discussions about the future of the Reich, as well as Hitler's personal fate. He was at his side when he married Eva Braun and when he wrote his political testament, in which he was designated as the executor of the dictator's last wishes, which reaffirmed his trusted status. After the Führer's suicide, when the bunker was plunged into confusion, it was Bormann who lit the way and began planning the escape from Berlin.
To get an idea of just how difficult that task would be, we need to take a look at the situation as it stood at the end of April 1945. After the death of Hitler on the afternoon of the 30th of April, alongside his wife of 36 hours, Eva Braun, the Soviets had already surrounded Berlin and had begun to drive inwards towards the heart of the city.
On May 1st, the Nazis cornered in the bunker realized they had only hours to act. The Red Army was just a few meters from the German Chancellery, and its arrival was inevitable. Escape was the only option to avoid ending up dead, or, at best, as prisoners of a brutal enemy who would not hesitate to torture them. Martin Bormann joined the members of the Inner Circle, including the Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, the head of the Hitler Youth, Arthur Axmann, among other officials. Beyond the risks, everyone agreed that the plan to flee from Stalin's men was the best alternative. If they managed to break through their lines, they would have a good chance of escaping to a new destination. Or at least they would be caught by the Western Allied forces, where the hope of finding refuge and negotiating a surrender was greater. Their challenge was to avoid the massive presence of Soviet soldiers who had invaded the streets of Berlin and were advancing mercilessly, mowing down any German who crossed their path. With all this in mind, the group was ready to depart the Führerbunker after midnight on May 1st, 1945.
As we see from this American aerial footage from July 1945, above-ground Berlin was at that time a wasteland of ruins, but on the 1st of May was also crawling with Soviet tanks and infantry. That left only one real option: the underground railways. The network of Berlin U-Bahn stations, running today exactly as it did in 1945, allowed someone with good knowledge and a large slice of luck to traverse much of the centre of the city below ground.
The city was in ruins and completely controlled by Soviet troops. In addition, there were multiple surveillance points and constant bombing. The escape route through Berlin's underground tunnels seemed like a miracle solution to avoid explosives and patrols on the surface. The initial plan was to reach the north of the city by means of the Weidendammer Bridge over the Spree River. From there, it was hoped to be able to advance towards the Western Allied lines or to some safe escape point, that is, areas without the presence of the Red Army that would open a path to another town or country. In the midst of darkness, on May 2nd, the last Nazis left the bunker and were confronted with the first images of a destroyed Berlin. While they tried to assimilate the shocking image, the tenacious fire of the Soviet forces generated enormous confusion that ended up dividing the group. Martin Bormann and some of his closest men tried to advance towards the west, but found insurmountable obstacles. Although the situation was already desperate, the tension only increased. During the crossing of the Weidendammer Bridge, a large number of enemy soldiers suddenly appeared. The brutal ambush improvised by Stalin's men triggered a violent confrontation that began to collapse the Nazis' plan. Without any strategy and with the sole objective of surviving, the fugitives scattered even further, leaving behind a huge bloodstain. It was at this place that Adolf Hitler's personal secretary was last seen. The same happened to Ludwig Stumpfegger, who was assumed to have died during the fighting. For his part, Arthur Axmann managed to avoid capture initially, but was arrested shortly afterwards in another part of Berlin. The rest of the group that intended to escape also did not manage to leave the city. After wandering through the ruined streets, without food or any possibility of advancing, during the course of the same 2nd of May they were arrested by the Soviets, one by one. It was all over for most of the Nazis who had been in the Führerbunker, but there was still one person left uncaught. Bormann's whereabouts were a mystery, as no one had seen him again.
Some believe that Borman died during the final moments of the battle for Berlin. Arthur Axmann, commander of the Hitler Youth, claims to have seen the body lying under the Invalidenstrasse Bridge in Berlin, but an excavation in 1965 fails to locate it.
Despite Axmann's statement, the body of Hitler's private secretary had not been found. Given this, the chances of his still being alive increased, and everything seemed to point to his having managed to escape successfully. For many years, there was great uncertainty about what exactly happened to Martin Bormann. After the war, there were rumors that he was living and hiding in South America, which fueled conspiracy theories around the so-called rat lines. This was the name given to the clandestine escape routes established to help Nazi war criminals flee Europe at the end of World War II. These allowed many of those responsible for the Holocaust and the regime's atrocities to avoid being captured by the Allies and brought to justice at the Nuremberg trials. The network of secret routes was organized in particular with the help of Western intelligence agencies, which shared the idea of protecting certain Nazi leaders in order to fight against the growing communist influence on the old continent. They mainly took the fugitives to Latin American countries, such as Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, and sometimes to Spain and other neutral places. Any of these could have been the fate of Martin Bormann, who despite his absence was sentenced to death during the Nuremberg trials. If his whereabouts were ever discovered, he would have to face his fatal punishment. However, the years continued to pass and the mystery grew ever deeper.
Some men, because of their striking resemblance, are even accused of being Bormann. Then, in 1972, the West German government claims to discover Bormann's body at a building site near the Führer bunker. A pathologist examines the corpse. A year later, he declares the skull is definitely that of Bormann, but something is peculiar. The soil found around the skull is thick red clay, not the yellow sandy soil typical of Berlin.
Despite having confirmed that the body found did indeed belong to Martin Bormann, the type of soil found caused the mystery surrounding him to continue to grow. That clay was common in a region of Paraguay where there was a German settlement. In this way, the investigation to find out the history of the Nazi reached Latin America. The police of that country responded to the search for information about that character, assuring that Hitler's secretary had indeed spent his last years of life there, until he died in 1958 and was buried in those lands. However, that theory did not resolve the circumstances of the discovery of his remains in Berlin. The hypotheses surrounding Bormann's fate after the war continued to emerge. Some ventured a supposed trip to Madrid or even England. However, a new forensic analysis carried out in 1999 determined that the Nazi leader had died on May 2, 1945. Possibly by committing suicide with a cyanide capsule, although some suggest that he could have died from wounds suffered during the escape or from a bombing. The mystery remains. The most solid version seems to support that the attempt to escape had been useless. Bormann had lost his life shortly after leaving the bunker, very close to the place where he had faithfully served Hitler. The legend of his possible escape endured for years, but finally, his fate was sealed in the streets of a Berlin in ruins, just like the regime he helped build. Now, after having learned the story behind the last occupants of the shelter where Adolf Hitler died, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us to the end. We hope to see you again in our next video.